The barn was still standing. That was the first thing Ezra Colt noticed when the wind dropped enough to see across the valley. Not the absence of smoke, not the drifts that had buried the fence posts to their caps, but the fact that the structure was still there, half swallowed by white, its peaked roof carrying a weight of snow that would have collapsed a lesser building. He stood at the edge of his own property with his scarf pulled to his eyes and studied the Dearborn place for a long moment. The cabin beside the barn sat dark. No light in the single window, no column of smoke from the chimney. Nothing moving in the yard, no tracks between the buildings, no sign that anything alive had passed through that space in the last 12 hours at least. He told himself it meant nothing. People stayed inside during storms. People ran low on wood and burned small, careful fires that did not produce much smoke. People slept through the worst hours and emerged when conditions improved. He had done all of those things himself in bad winters, and he was still here. But he had also been a miner for 15 years in Colorado before his back drove him north to Wyoming in 1862. And in that time, he had learned to read stillness the way other men read weather. There was the stillness of a place where people were waiting, conserving, enduring. Then there was the stillness of a place where nothing was left to wait. He turned back toward his own house. The temperature was somewhere below 40 degrees below zero, and thinking clearly required warmth, and warmth required wood. And the woodpile was not going to last another 4 days at the rate his family was burning through it. He pushed the thought of Willa Dearborn's dark cabin to the back of his mind where it settled like a stone in cold water and stayed there. 15 months earlier, in the first week of October 1886, Willa Dearborn had begun digging. She had not announced it. She had not asked permission, had not sought advice, had not mentioned it to her children until the hole was already 3 feet deep, and she needed Owen's help carrying buckets of displaced earth to the low spot behind the barn where the spring runoff collected and left the ground soft. Owen was 10 years old that autumn, and he had his mother's disposition towards silence, which meant he looked at the hole, looked at his mother, picked up a bucket, and started carrying without asking a single question. That was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the two of them had established a routine up before light into the barn to feed the horses and the cow before the morning cold reached its worst. Then down into the excavation with the lantern hung from a nail. Willa had driven into the lowest beam of the barn's floor joists. They worked until the light outside the barn's single small window turned gray-white with morning. Then Willa climbed out, brushed the dirt from her coat, and began the visible work of the day, chopping wood, mending fence, doing the 100 tasks that a homestead required of a woman alone. Nobody saw them dig. That was not an accident. To understand why Willa Dearborn spent the autumn of 1886 digging a room into the earth beneath her barn, you had to understand the winter of 1884 to 1885. And to understand that winter, you had to understand Garrett. Garrett Dearborn had been a carpenter by training and an optimist by temperament, which was a dangerous combination in the Wyoming territory. He had read articles in an Ohio newspaper about the opportunities awaiting men of skill and industry in the West, and he had believed those articles in the way that young men with good hands and limited experience believed things completely without reserving any portion of his confidence for the possibility that the articles were written by men who had never spent a January in a Wyoming valley. He brought his wife and their 2 children west in the spring of 1883, filed a homestead claim on 160 acres along a creek that the territory maps called Harrow Creek, and spent the first summer building the cabin in the barn with the focused energy of a man who believed that preparation was the answer to every problem. The cabin was solid. Garrett knew timber and he knew joints, and the walls he raised were plumb, and the chinking he packed between the logs was thorough. He built a sleeping loft for the children above the main room and a stone fireplace wide enough to take 4-foot logs. He was proud of that fireplace. He showed it to Willa the evening he finished it, running his hand along the hearthstone the way he might have touched something valuable, and she had told him it was fine work because it was. What Garrett had not fully accounted for, what the articles in the Ohio newspaper had not mentioned, was the wind. The wind that came off the mountains north of Harrow Creek did not blow so much as it searched. It found the gaps between logs that the chinking had not quite sealed. It discovered the place where the chimney met the wall and worked at the joint through successive freeze and thaw cycles until a crack opened that admitted a finger of cold air directly into the room. It identified the floor pine planks laid over packed earth as the weakest point in the structure and came up through the gaps between boards on the coldest nights spreading frost across the wood in patterns that Ivy, who was 4 years old that first winter, and delighted by strange things called the floor flowers. Garrett was alive for 2 winters. The second one started coming for him at Christmas, the way these things do quietly and without drama. A cough that he dismissed a heaviness in his chest, that he attributed to having spent too long splitting wood in the cold. A pallor that Willa noticed and said nothing about, because she was the kind of woman who understood that naming a fear aloud sometimes gave it permission to arrive. By January, he was running a fever that spiked at night and broke toward dawn, leaving him soaked through and exhausted. Willa heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in flannel and packed them against his chest and his feet. She made broth from the last of the salt pork. She sat up through the worst nights reading aloud from the Bible in a low voice, not because she believed the words would heal him, but because the sound seemed to keep him anchored to the present, and the present was the only place where he still had a chance. Garrett Dearborn died on the 14th of February, 1885. He was 37 years old. The ground was too frozen to bury him until April, and Willa spent those intervening weeks in a cabin with her husband's body wrapped in canvas in the barn, and 2 children who were too young to understand fully what had happened and too old to be entirely spared from it. She did not have the luxury of extended grief. The homestead required her. The animals required her. Owen required her. Ivy, who caught a chest cold in March that settled into her lungs and built a residence there, through the rest of that winter, required her most of all. That first winter alone, Willa burned through her entire supply of wood by the 3rd week of February. She burned the rocking chair that had come with them from Ohio. She burned the wooden crate that had held the dry goods she had ordered from the general store in Caldwell Crossing. She burned 2 boards she pried from the barn's south wall, which created a gap she later stuffed with burlap and hay. She kept Ivy beside the fire through the worst nights, her daughter's breath a thin rasp in the cold air, the child's skin the color of old candle wax. She told Ivy stories, invented ones long and wandering with horses and rivers, and girls who found secret doors in hillsides that led to warm underground kingdoms. And Ivy listened with her eyes half closed and her small fingers wrapped around her mother's wrist, and slowly across the grinding weeks of February and March, the color came back into her face. When the ground softened enough in April to bury Garrett, Willa stood at the grave she had dug herself. Owen had helped his small face set with an expression she recognized as concentrated grief, trying to look useful, and she made herself a promise that was not dramatic and was not spoken aloud. She simply decided, with the certainty of a woman who had spent a winter understanding exactly what she was up against, that the following winter would not find her in the same position. She did not yet know what different would look like. She only knew that the cabin as it stood was not adequate. The following autumn brought the realization. It was a night in the 2nd week of September 1886, warm enough still that the cold was a rumor rather than a presence, but cool enough that the barn's interior held a quality of air that felt different from the outside. Willa went in after supper to check on Biscuit, the older of her 2 horses, who had been favoring his left foreleg for 3 days. She had developed the habit over the months since Garrett's death of working without a lantern when the moon was sufficient, which it was that night, a 3/4 moon, throwing silver light through the gaps in the barn's south wall. She examined Biscuit's leg by touch, and moonlight found nothing she could do about it tonight, and straightened up. She had intended to go immediately back to the cabin, but she did not. She stood in the center of the barn, and she noticed something. She was not cold. This was not a small observation. The evenings had been dropping into the 40s, and she had been wearing her coat inside the cabin to conserve firewood. But here in the barn, with no fire and no lantern, she was not cold. The 2 horses radiated a steady animal warmth. The cow added her own. The hay stacked in the loft above acted as a ceiling of insulation between the barn's interior and the night sky. The structure's foundation was banked with earth on the north side, where the prevailing wind hit hardest, and that earthen banking cut the wind's reach before it could infiltrate the walls. Willa pressed her palm flat against the dirt floor of the barn and held it there. The earth beneath her hand was not warm exactly, not warm the way a hearthstone is warm, but it was not cold either. It held something, a memory of summer stored in the density of the soil, releasing itself slowly into the enclosed space above. She knelt down in the dirt and pressed both palms flat and thought about that. The earth was a battery. She did not have that word for it. That was not a word her world had given her yet, but she understood the concept intuitively. The way people who work with materials for long enough come to understand the properties of those materials through their hands rather than their education. The earth absorbed heat over the long months of spring and summer and held it the way a cast iron skillet holds heat long after you have moved it off the fire. Deep enough below the surface, the temperature remains stable, not warm in any comfortable sense, but stable. Not warm enough to sustain life on its own, but warm enough that a small, efficient fire in an enclosed underground space could push the ambient temperature to something survivable, and the earth itself would hold that warmth for hours after the fire went out. The cabin sat on top of the ground. Every surface of it was exposed to the sky and the wind. The floor, the walls, the roof, all of them were battlegrounds between the heat inside and the cold outside, and the cold always had more resources for a longer fight. But underneath the ground, underneath the barn, where the livestock's body heat came down through the floorboards and the hay above insulated against the sky, and the earthen banking on three sides blocked the wind, a different physics applied. Willa stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and stood for another minute in the dark barn, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls. Then she went inside, sat at the table with the lamp turned low, and opened the small notebook she had been using to track her seed inventory and the weights of the animals and the dates of first and last frost. She turned to a blank page and began to draw. She drew badly and she drew carefully, the way people draw when they are thinking rather than when they are trying to produce something presentable. She drew a cross-section of the barn floor as she imagined it, with the earth beneath it in layers, then a rectangle below the floor line. Calculating from the dimensions, she knew how large a space she could excavate without compromising the barn's structural integrity. 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 7 feet deep, deep enough to stand in, deep enough to put the space well below the frost line. She wrote those dimensions down and looked at them for a while. Then she wrote drainage and drew an arrow to the lowest corner of the rectangle, and beside it gravel sump. Then walls dry, stone slope, inward gravity holds. Then frame salvage from collapsed shed, perpendicular to existing joists. Then entry trap door, flush with barn floor, southwest corner, away from stalls. Then vent clay pipe through north wall disguised as foundation vent. Then hearth small corner, clay-lined fire, brick modest fire only. She looked at what she had written. It was not an engineering diagram. It was a woman's thinking done in pencil in a household notebook by lamplight after her children were asleep. But the logic of it was sound, and she knew the logic was sound because she had been living with the problem long enough to have developed an instinct for what would and would not work. She closed the notebook and went to bed. She lay in the dark in the cabin that leaked cold through every surface and listened to the wind working at the walls, and she thought about what it would mean to spend the coming winter warm. She began digging on the second day of October. The excavation was the hardest part, and not just in the physical sense, though. It was that too, 7 feet of Wyoming soil dense with clay and threaded through with the roots of the grass that had been building its mat for decades before Garrett filed his claim. Willa worked with a pointed shovel and a pick, loosening the soil in sections and filling the wooden buckets she had brought from the root cellar. One after another, hauling them up the ladder she had propped against the opening. She had cut through the barn floor and carrying them in the pre-dawn darkness to the low spot behind the barn. The physical difficulty she had prepared for. What she had not prepared for was the quality of the silence in which the work happened. In her previous life, the life before Garrett died, the life before Wyoming, the life when she was the daughter of a hardware merchant in Columbus, and the world had a known shape, she had understood silence as the absence of noise. Working in the cold dark of the pre-dawn 7 feet below her barn floor, while her children slept in the cabin and the horses shifted above her. She came to understand silence as something more specific, the sound of doing something that no one around you understood and not yet knowing whether you were right. Owen came to her on the 4th morning. He had followed her to the barn in the dark, which he had apparently been doing for 3 days without her knowing, watching from the barn doorway as she descended the ladder. On the 4th morning, he walked across the barn floor, looked down into the hole, looked at his mother standing in it, and climbed down the ladder. He picked up the spare bucket without a word and began filling it. They worked side by side in the lamplight, the mother and the boy passing buckets up the ladder and returning for more. Willa could not have said why it moved her as much as it did. Owen was 10 years old. He was her child. Helping her was what children did. But there was something in his wordless comprehension, his immediate understanding that this was real work toward a real purpose, that undid her briefly in a way that nothing else had since Garrett's death. She kept her face turned away until the feeling passed. By the third week, the excavation was complete. By the fourth week, the dry stone walls were rising flat sandstone and limestone from the Harrow Creek bed, hauled in the wagon over 4 successive trips, each stone chosen for its flatness and fitted to its neighbor the way a puzzle is assembled, with patience and an eye for the larger shape. Willis set each stone with a slight inward lean so that gravity would hold the wall together from the inside, the same principle that holds an arch in place. Behind the stone, she packed earth tight against the surrounding soil, creating a barrier between the chamber and the moisture that moved through the ground in spring. The floor she tamped with the back of the shovel until it was as hard as wood, then shaped it so that the center sat fractionally higher than the edges, encouraging any water that seeped in to run to the low corner where she had dug the sump, a hole 18 inches deep filled with creek gravel, which would collect groundwater and hold it below the floor level. The timber framing was salvage work which suited her. The old shed that had collapsed the previous spring had been built from good Douglas fir, and she cut and fitted the beams to run perpendicular to the barn's existing floor joists, creating a ceiling for the underground room that could carry the weight of 2 horses, a cow stored hay, and the occasional visit of a neighbor without flexing. She mortised the joints by hand with a chisel from Garrett's toolbox, one of the few things of his she had kept out of sentiment, and pegged them with wooden dowels cut from a length of hickory rod she had bought in Caldwell Crossing the previous spring for no reason she could then have articulated. The trap door she set in the southwest corner of the barn away from the stalls, fitting it so precisely to its frame that when closed it was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. She made the ladder from 2 8-foot lengths of the fir, runged with dowel, steep enough to be compact and shallow enough not to be dangerous for ivy. The ventilation system took her 3 days of trial and error. She had 4 clay drainage tiles, each 8 inches in diameter, acquired from the hardware section of the general store in Caldwell Crossing, under the guise of drainage work around the cabin foundation. She mortared them end to end with a mixture of clay and fine sand, running the assembled pipe from the chamber's ceiling, where the warm air and combustion gases would naturally collect up through a hole she bored in the barn floor, and then horizontally through the barn's north wall at floor level, where it emerged into the gap between the barn's foundation banking and the earthen berm disguised as a foundation vent. Cold air from outside could not flow in through the pipe because warm air from inside was always flowing out, and the pipe's horizontal section meant wind could not drive directly down into the chamber. She confirmed this on the first test burn by watching the smoke carefully and timing it 4 seconds from lighting to clean draw. The ventilation pipe did not run straight up like a conventional chimney. Instead, it exited horizontally through the barn's north wall at ground level, emerging into the sheltered gap between the foundation banking and the earthen berm on the windward side of the structure. Smoke from the small evening fires dispersed into that sheltered gap before reaching open air, spreading low and thin rather than rising in a visible column. From any distance across the valley, a person looking toward the Dearborn property would see no smoke at all, not because nothing was burning, but because the combustion product was too diffuse and too close to the ground to be visible against the snow. The hearth she built in the northwest corner of the chamber, using the fire brick she had purchased at some cost in eggs and butter and one of the cured hams she had been saving from Douglas Fenn at the general store. She had told Fenn the fire brick was for repairing the cabin's fireplace. Fenn had nodded and said he had heard the mortar on older fireplaces crumbled faster in cold climates, and she had agreed that it did. The hearth was not large. That was deliberate. A large hearth in a small underground space would overheat the chamber and consume far more wood than necessary. She designed it as a firebox, only roughly 18 inches wide and 14 deep, with a clay-lined flue that rose to the ventilation pipe connection above. It was designed to hold a fire of 3 to 4 small logs, nothing more. The theory, and it was only a theory until she tested, it was that the earth surrounding the chamber would absorb heat from that modest fire and release it slowly over the following hours, maintaining a stable temperature long after the fire itself had died to coals and ash. She tested this on the 22nd of November, 1886, at 8:30 in the evening, after Owen and Ivy were asleep in the cabin. She descended alone, lit the lantern set, 2 logs and a handful of kindling in the hearth, and touched a match to it. The fire caught. The smoke rose, paused for 2 seconds at the flue opening, then drew cleanly upward. She watched it for 10 minutes to confirm the draw was consistent, then sat on the rope-frame bed she had assembled against the east wall and watched the fire burn. An hour later, she added one more log. An hour after that, she let the fire die down to coals without adding more wood. She sat in the darkening space and felt the temperature. Then she retrieved the mercury thermometer that had been Garrett's. He had bought it at a scientific supply house in Columbus, believing accurate temperature records would help him predict weather patterns, a theory that had proven largely correct and had not saved him anyway, and held it at chest height in the center of the room. She waited 3 minutes, then she brought it to the lantern. 56 degrees Fahrenheit. She looked at the thermometer for a long time. Outside the barn, the temperature was 18 degrees. The difference between inside the underground chamber and outside the barn was 38 degrees, achieved with 2 logs and a handful of kindling and 1 hour of modest fire. She sat back down on the bed. She was not a demonstrative woman. She had not cried at Garrett's graveside, had not cried through the winter that followed, had not cried through the nights when Ivy's fever spiked, and she sat in the cold cabin, certain that she was watching her daughter die, 1 degree at a time. She had held those things the way the earth held heat, taken them in, pressed them down, kept them from escaping into the air where they would do no good. She cried now, not dramatically, not with any sound that would have carried beyond the stone walls of the chamber. She simply put her face in her hands and let it happen, because the thing she was feeling could not be contained by her usual means. The feeling was not triumph. It was something more fundamental. It was the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a long time and has finally been given permission to exhale. She knew, sitting in her 56-degree room with the last of the fire cooling to gray ash in the corner, that her children were going to survive the winter. Not might survive. Were going to. She did not move the children down to the chamber that night. She wanted to test it over several days first to be certain the temperature held, to make sure the ventilation performed consistently. She descended each of the next 3 nights, lit a small fire, let it burn for an hour or 2, then checked the thermometer after the fire went out. The temperature ranged between 52 and 57 degrees on those nights, depending on the outside cold and the size of the fire. On the 3rd night, she burned no fire at all and found the temperature at 49 degrees in the morning cold, but well above freezing, attributable almost entirely to the earth itself. People noticed she was doing something. This was unavoidable in a valley where homesteads were spread across miles of open country, and everyone's routine was visible to everyone else's eye from a distance. What exactly they noticed was harder to say. Movement in the mornings. Willa's wagon making trips to the creek that did not seem to involve water. The sound of metal on stone that carried in the cold air further than she had anticipated. By November, the talk had started in the quiet way. Talk always started in Caldwell Crossing, which is to say quietly enough that everyone knew about it within a week, while maintaining the fiction that it was not being discussed. Reverend Aldous Marsh was the one who addressed it directly. Marsh was 55, originally from Virginia, with the measured diction of a man who had learned early that words once spoken could not be recalled. He had come to Wyoming in 1878 and built the congregation at Caldwell Crossing through a combination of genuine pastoral care and a talent for saying difficult things in ways that were difficult to argue with. He was not a cruel man. He was not even an unkind one. But he was a man who understood, perhaps more intuitively than deliberately, that influence depended on a community's consensus about what was normal, and something outside the normal made him professionally attentive. He encountered Willa outside the general store on the 4th of November. He had been waiting for a natural moment, and this was it. She was loading flour and coffee into the wagon bed, and he walked over and offered to help with the heavier sacks, and she thanked him and let him. And for a moment they worked side by side in the way of neighbors who are comfortable with each other, which they were. Then Marsh said in his careful Virginia voice, "I have heard you have been doing some work around the barn, Mrs. Dearborn, getting settled in for winter." Willa set a sack in the wagon bed. "Some work, yes. Digging, people are saying." She looked at him directly. She told him what she was doing, not everything, not the thermal calculations she had worked through in her notebook, but the essential structure: a room below the barn floor, stone walls, a small hearth, a ventilation pipe. She said it plainly, the way she would have described mending a fence. Marsh listened with the focused attention of a man who is simultaneously receiving information and assessing it for implications he does not yet fully see. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then his voice carried the particular weight of genuine concern shaped into warning. "Mrs. Dearborn, I have seen men try to winter underground before. Not here back east, a fellow near my father's property tried a root cellar for sleeping. Spring came and the moisture had settled in his lungs. Not from cold, from damp. He was dead by July." Willa said, "I have accounted for drainage." Marsh nodded slowly. "I hope you have. I genuinely hope you have." He picked up the last of the flour sacks. "I would hate to see you and those children in difficulty. You have had enough difficulty." It was said with sincere concern. She knew that. She thanked him for his help, climbed onto the wagon, and drove back toward Harrow Creek. Behind her, she was reasonably certain he was already composing the version of this conversation he would share with his wife that evening. And from there it would move through the congregation the way water moves through soil, quietly in all directions, at once finding its level everywhere. She was not wrong about that. By the second week of November, she was aware of the specific quality of attention that follows a woman who has been decided to have done something peculiar. Not hostile attention, nothing so direct, but the kind of careful noticing that expresses itself in conversations that pause when she approaches in questions, phrased as concerns, in the particular sympathy that a community extends to someone it has collectively agreed to pity. Ezra Colt came to her on the 12th. He arrived in the afternoon, tied his horse at the barn hitching post, and walked to where she was splitting wood behind the cabin. He was direct, that was Ezra's way, and he prefaced nothing. He said he had worked in mines for 15 years and he understood Earth. He said he had heard what she was doing and he had no quarrel with the principle. Then his voice carried the steady weight of experience laid without cruelty. "Wyoming ground is not Colorado ground, Mrs. Dearborn. The clay holds water different. I have seen shafts in this territory flood in the spring thaw in ways that would have been impossible in Colorado, and the men who built them were experienced men who knew what they were doing." He paused. "I am not saying you are wrong. I am saying I have seen men who were right about the principle lose everything because the specific application did not account for local conditions." She set the axe head on the chopping block and looked at him. His concern was genuine. She could read that in the straightforward way he stood there, not performing kindness, but actually in the grip of it. Ezra Colt had been in Wyoming since 1862, 25 years in this territory, and he had seen things fail in ways that people who had not been here long enough could not anticipate. She said the drainage runs to a gravel sump in the lowest corner. The walls lean inward, so groundwater pressure pushes the stone toward the room and not away from it. The floor slopes a quarter-inch per foot toward the sump. I have run water through the system from a bucket, and it cleared in under 4 minutes. She paused. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Colt. I have taken the local conditions into account." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once. "I hope so." He untied his horse and left without further comment. That evening, Owen came in from the Collier place with his coat still on and his face flushed with cold, and something else, embarrassment, which was a new emotion for Owen, and sat on his face in an unfamiliar way. His voice came out lower than usual. "Ben Collier said we live like prairie dogs." Willa was at the table cutting salt pork into the pot for supper. She set the knife down. She looked at her son for a moment, his jaw set, his eyes carrying the specific misery of a child who has been mocked for something connected to his mother. She understood what he needed, and it was not reassurance. Reassurance would have told him his embarrassment was reasonable. What he needed was the truth. She said, "Put your coat back on." She took the lantern from the table and led him through the cold to the barn. Opened the trapdoor, went down the ladder, and he followed. They stood in the underground room in the lamplight. The temperature was 53 degrees. She had burned a small fire the previous evening, and the earth was still releasing it. Owen's breath was barely visible in the air. In the cabin, even with the fire going, their breath hung white in the room. She put his hand flat against the stone wall, held it there. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "It is warm." She said, "That is the earth, not wood, not fire. The earth itself holding what summer gave it and giving it back. Prairie dogs do not live underground because they are poor, Owen. They live underground because they understood something about this land before we arrived." She moved the lantern so the flame illuminated the ceiling, the underside of the barn floor above them, with the faint weight of the whole structure pressing down from above. Up there, your horses are standing right now. Their heat is coming down through those boards. The hay in the loft is keeping the sky from touching us. The earth around these walls has been soaking up summer heat for 100 years before we ever set foot here. She put his hand back against the wall. Who is smarter? The man who fights the winter every single night and runs out of wood in February, or the person who figures out that the earth has already done the work? Owen was quiet for a moment, turning it over with the deliberateness he brought to everything. Then, we are going to be warmer than Ben Collier. She looked at her son. We are going to be significantly warmer than Ben Collier. She moved the children's bedding to the underground room in the third week of November. She did this without ceremony, carrying the pallets and blankets down the ladder in 2 trips, arranging Ivy's pallet closest to the small hearth and Owen's against the east wall where the stone was thickest. Ivy descended the ladder for the first time that evening and stood in the lamplight looking around the room with the evaluative seriousness that 7-year-olds apply to things that are genuinely new to them. Ivy said, "Are we sleeping in the ground?" Willa said, "For the winter." Ivy said, "Like seeds." Willa looked at her daughter, thin-shouldered, bright-eyed, the child who had spent 3 weeks in February the previous year, too sick to do more than breathe, and let her mother press warm stones against her chest. Willa said, "Yes, exactly like seeds." She lit the small fire that night, 2 logs, a handful of kindling. She let it burn for an hour and a half, then banked it. She waited until both children were asleep. Owen curled on his side with one arm under his head. Ivy on her back with her mouth slightly open in the particular way she had always slept since infancy. Then Willa retrieved the thermometer from the shelf above the bed and held it at chest height in the center of the room. 54 degrees. She hung the thermometer back on its nail. She turned down the lantern. She lay in the dark on her rope-frame bed with the stone walls around her, and the earth pressing close on all sides, and the faint warmth of the banked fire still breathing from the corner hearth. And above her, the boards of the barn floor, and above those the hooves of her horses shifting in the dark, and above those the hay stacked 8 feet deep, and above that the Wyoming sky with its December cold banking against the outside of the world. She did not feel buried. She felt for the first time in 2 years protected. The winter had not truly arrived yet. What was coming, what the old-timers would later call the worst in the territory's recorded history, what would kill livestock across 3 states and drive families from their claims and change the way people thought about shelter in the Northern Territories, that was still 3 weeks away. But Willa Dearborn was ready for it in a way that no one around her understood, in a way that no one had thought to ask about, in a way that the coming weeks would prove beyond any argument that mockery or concern could mount. She lay in her 54-degree room in the dark and listened to her children breathe. And for the first time in a long time, their breathing did not sound fragile. It sounded like something that would last. The horses knew first. Ezra Colt had learned this in the mines, that animals registered what human senses filtered out, that the body of a horse or a mule carried instruments more finely calibrated than anything a man could build. On the morning of January 9th, 1887, he woke at 4 o'clock to the sound of his 2 horses moving in their stalls with a restlessness that was not hunger. They were not kicking. They were not distressed in any way he could name. They were simply moving, shifting weight, turning in small circles, the way animals move when something in the air has changed and they cannot decide which direction to face away from it. He dressed in the dark, pulling on 2 wool shirts before his coat, and went outside. The temperature was already below 0. He could feel that immediately, the specific quality of cold that sits in the lungs differently than ordinary winter cold, heavier with an edge to it. But it was the sky that stopped him. The moon was full and should have been bright, but it sat behind a film of high cloud that turned it the color of old pewter, and the light it threw across the valley was flat without shadow. The mountains to the north were gone, not obscured by cloud in the ordinary sense, simply absent, as if the horizon had been erased. The air smelled faintly of iron. Ezra had seen that sky once before in the winter of 1871 in Kansas, when he had been driving cattle north with a crew of 7 men. That storm had killed 2 of the cattle and 1 of the men before it was over. He went back inside and told his wife Helen to build the largest fire the fireplace would hold, and to keep it that way and not to let it drop below full burn for any reason. She looked at his face and did not ask questions. She was 53 years old and had been married to him for 31 years, long enough to know the difference between the various qualities of his silence, and this one required no interpretation. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise along the northern horizon. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to -15. By 4 o'clock, when the light was already going out of the short winter afternoon, the first wind came not as a gust, not as a gradual increase, but as a single solid impact, as if the atmosphere itself had decided all at once to move south at 50 miles per hour. The snow arrived 20 minutes after the wind. It did not fall. It flew horizontal, dense, driven with a force that turned the air white and eliminated the middle distance completely. Ezra stood at his window and watched his barn disappear into the white, which took approximately 4 seconds, and then there was nothing outside the window but moving white and the occasional dark suggestion of the fence post closest to the house. He had 90 feet of rope strung between the house and the barn. He had done this every winter for 24 years, run a line between the two structures so that he could find his way in zero visibility. He had used it perhaps 6 times in those 24 years. He used it 3 times on the first day of that storm alone. Across the valley, the families of Harrow Creek were making calculations that grew grimmer as the hours passed. Reverend Aldous Marsh had a fireplace that was wide and deep, built for cooking as much as heating, which meant it consumed wood at a rate that a man had to stand and watch to fully believe. By the end of the first day, he had burned through a quarter cord. His wife Louisa kept the children in the room closest to the fireplace, piling every blanket and coat they owned onto the 2 youngest, who were 4 and 6, and whose bodies did not generate sufficient heat on their own to compensate for what the walls were losing. The cabin registered 51 degrees by Marsh's thermometer at midnight of the first night, with a fire burning at full capacity. By 2 in the morning, it was 47. He added more wood. The temperature climbed back to 48 and stayed there. He sat in the chair beside the fire and watched the wood pile in his mind, counting logs against days, and the arithmetic did not resolve into anything he wanted to look at directly. Cecily Ford lived alone in the small cabin attached to the schoolhouse at the eastern edge of what people called the Caldwell Crossing settlement, though settlement was a generous word for 8 buildings strung along a quarter mile of frozen road. The schoolhouse had been built the previous year with green lumber that had since warped at every joint, creating gaps in the walls that Cecily had stuffed with rags in October, replacing them in November when the rags compressed. The fireplace was adequate for the schoolroom, but the attached cabin was an afterthought in its construction, sharing only one wall with the main building's heat. She had a small cast-iron stove that burned wood efficiently, but was too small to carry a fire through the night without refueling. On the second night, she woke at 3 in the morning to find the stove cold and the cabin at 31 degrees. She could see her breath in the dark. She rebuilt the fire with fingers that took 15 minutes to regain full sensation, then sat in her coat with a blanket across her shoulders and thought with the clear logic of a woman who taught mathematics and therefore did not permit herself comforting illusions about how many days her wood supply would last and what would happen after that. The answer was 8 days of wood at current burn rate, and after that there was furniture of which she had limited quantities, followed by structural elements of the building, which would eventually compromise the building's ability to shelter her. This was not a sequence she could extend indefinitely. What she did not yet know, what no one outside the Dearborn property knew, was that 3 miles west across the valley, Willa Dearborn was not having this problem. The storm had arrived for Willa the same way it had arrived for everyone else. The iron smell in the air, the horses moving with that particular restlessness, the sky's northern edge turning bruise-colored before the wind came. Willa had read these signs with the same attention Ezra had brought to them, because she had learned to read the land the same way through sustained observation over years of consequence. When the wind hit that afternoon, she was already inside the barn, having fed the animals a larger portion of hay than usual, topped the water trough, checked the latch on every stall gate twice. She descended through the trap door at 5 o'clock with Owen behind her carrying the lantern, with Ivy already below, having gone down an hour earlier, when the wind made the cabin walls audible in a way that frightened her. Willa pulled the trapdoor closed above them. She heard the barn above the wind working at the boards, the horses stamping, the particular sound of a structure under pressure. And then the trapdoor's insulation did its work, and the sound became something distant, manageable, like weather heard from inside a solid house. She lit a small fire. 3 logs, which was one more than her usual evening fire, a concession to the wind's intensity and the knowledge that the outside temperature was dropping faster than any ordinary January night. She sat at the small table and read to Ivy from the collection of primers she had ordered the previous spring from a bookseller in Cheyenne. Owen across the room on his pallet worked through a page of arithmetic problems by lamplight. The temperature in the room at 9 o'clock that night with the fire still burning was 61 degrees. Willa let the fire burn down to coals at 10. She checked the thermometer at midnight after the fire had been out for 2 hours, 57 degrees. She went back to sleep. By the morning of the second day, the storm had consolidated into something that the territory had not seen before, or at least had not recorded. The temperature outside dropped to negative 28. The wind did not diminish, it held at a sustained speed that made travel between buildings genuinely dangerous. Not in the way that cold is dangerous when you are insufficiently dressed, but in the way that wind-driven cold is dangerous when it can extract heat from a human body faster than that body can generate it, regardless of how many layers the body is wearing. Ezra made his rope-guided trip to the barn twice that day and found it an exercise in controlled fear both times. The rope was enough he could feel it in his hands the whole way, but the wind pushed at him with a physical insistence that was not like ordinary wind. It had a quality of intention to it that he recognized as the projection of his own fear onto weather, which was not rational, but which was also difficult to dismiss when the wind was trying to push him past the rope's reach. Inside the barn, the animals were holding. He gave them extra hay and broke the ice that had formed on the surface of the water trough. The temperature inside the barn was 22 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable, not cold enough to kill the livestock immediately. He did the math on that too, the way he had done the math on the wood, and the conclusion was the same kind of arithmetic that a man does not enjoy. He did not look toward the Dearborn property on that second day. He did not permit himself to. On the morning of the third day, the wind dropped for approximately 15 minutes for reasons that had to do with the storm's internal structure and that no one in the valley understood at the time. It simply paused the way a man pauses in heavy work to catch his breath, and in that pause, the white cleared enough that distances became visible again. Ezra was at his window when it happened. He looked out across the valley, reflexively taking inventory, the way a man of his habits always takes inventory when visibility returns: fence line, tree line, the dark shapes of the neighbors' buildings to the south, the ridge to the north, the Dearborn property to the west. He looked at the Dearborn property for a long time. The barn was there, still standing, drifted to the eaves on the north side, but the structure itself intact. The cabin beside it was dark, no lamp in the window. The barn showed no smoke from any direction, no column from any chimney, no trace of combustion product in the air above or around the structure. The barn looked like a building in which nothing was alive. The wind came back. The white returned. Ezra stepped away from the window. That night he did not sleep. He lay beside his wife in the dark, listening to the wind work at the cabin walls, and he ran the possibilities through his mind with the systematic attention of a man who has spent his life in situations where accurate assessment matters more than comfort. He considered the possibility that Willa had evacuated to Caldwell Crossing before the storm hit, which he dismissed because Willa Dearborn did not evacuate. He considered the possibility that she was burning coal rather than wood, which would explain the absence of visible smoke, and then dismissed this because he had never heard of her buying coal from the Caldwell Crossing supply, and coal was not something a person acquired without it being known. He considered the possibility that her ventilation system was working so efficiently that the smoke dispersed before becoming visible at a distance, which was at least theoretically possible, but which he could not convince himself to believe entirely. What he was left with after dismissing everything else was the possibility he had been trying not to think about. He lay in the dark and thought about it anyway. He told Helen in the morning, "I am going over to check on the Dearborn place." Helen looked at the window where the white was still moving outside. "In this, when it drops enough." He said it with a finality that she recognized, and she did not argue, but she put her hand on his arm for a moment before turning back to the fire. The wind dropped enough at mid-morning of the fourth day, not stopped, not safe, but reduced to something that a man with the right equipment and sufficient determination could move through. Negative 20 degrees with a wind of perhaps 20 miles per hour. Still dangerous. Still the kind of cold that would begin removing sensation from exposed skin within 2 minutes, but navigable. Ezra put on everything he owned that could be layered. 2 pairs of wool socks, the felt-lined boots, wool trousers with canvas trousers over them, 2 wool shirts, his heavy coat, a scarf that covered everything below his eyes, the rabbit fur hat that Helen had made for him 3 winters earlier, and that he had mocked at the time for its appearance. He retrieved the snowshoes from the barn, which took him 20 minutes of careful rope-guided travel each way. He checked the length of rope he kept coiled on a nail inside the barn door 60 feet and looped it over his shoulder. Before he left, he retrieved the digging bar from the back of the barn, the iron bar 4 feet long used for breaking frozen ground. He carried it over his shoulder with the rope. He told himself it was for breaking through drifts if he encountered them, which was true. He did not permit himself to think about the other reason he had taken it. The 2 miles from his property to the Dearborn place took him 1 hour and 20 minutes. The snow was chest-deep in the open sections of the valley where it had drifted, and the snowshoes kept him on top of it, but did not make it fast-going. He kept the fence line to his left where he could find it, losing it twice when the drifts had buried the posts, entirely recovering it by probing with the iron bar until he found the wire beneath the snow. He thought during that walk about the things Willa Dearborn had said to him when he had come to her with his warning about Wyoming clay. He thought about the precision with which she had described her drainage system, the gravel sump, the sloped floor, the inward-leaning walls. He thought about the thermometer which she had mentioned in passing, noting that she was tracking temperatures against the amount of wood burned in order to calibrate the hearth's output against the earth's retention. He thought about all of this and weighed it against the absence of smoke, and he arrived at the Dearborn barn without having reached any conclusion that gave him peace. The barn door was drifted shut on the east side, not buried, not inaccessible, but requiring 20 minutes of work with the iron bar to clear enough snow to pull it open. Ezra worked steadily without allowing himself to hurry, because hurrying in that cold produced sweat, which was the second fastest way to lose body heat after getting wet. He pulled the door open. The interior of the barn was dim lit by the gray light that came through the snow-filtered gaps in the south wall. It was cold. He estimated the barn's interior at 20 degrees, roughly the same as outside without the wind factor. He stepped in. His eyes adjusted. The 2 horses stood in their stalls. They turned their heads toward him. He looked at the floor of the stalls. Fresh hay had been scattered that morning. He could see the bright yellow of it against the darker packed bedding beneath. The water trough showed a skim of ice on the surface, which meant it had been open water within the last several hours. The cow stood in the rear stall, a fresh flake of hay at her feet. Someone had been in this barn that morning. Someone had fed these animals within the last 4 or 5 hours. He stood in the center of the barn and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched since the 3rd day of the storm. Then he heard it. From beneath his feet, muffled by the barn floor, passing up through the boards, with the quality of something heard through water, a child's voice, high and clear, singing something that took him a moment to identify as a Christmas hymn, one of the old ones about fire and cold and the promise of warmth. Ezra looked down at the floor. He took one step, then another, moving toward the southwest corner of the barn. He could see it now, the faint rectangular seam in the boards that he had not noticed when he entered because he had not been looking for it. The trapdoor fitting so precisely into its frame that it was nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding planks. He crouched down. He knocked on the wood twice with his gloved knuckle. The singing stopped. A silence of perhaps 5 seconds during which Ezra was aware of his own heartbeat in an unusually immediate way. Then a voice, adult, female, steady as a fence post. "Who is there?" His throat was tighter than he expected it to be. "Ezra Colt, Mrs. Dearborn. I came to check on you." Another silence, shorter. The sound of something moving, weight shifting, a ladder repositioning itself. The trapdoor lifted from below, swinging up and back, and Willa Dearborn's face appeared in the opening, her dark hair pinned neatly, her expression carrying the specific composed quality of a woman who has been living in her own company for 4 days and finds the appearance of a neighbor mildly surprising rather than distressing. She looked at him. She looked at the digging bar over his shoulder. She looked back at his face, and he saw in her eyes the exact moment she understood why he had brought the bar. She said nothing about that. She simply said, "Mr. Colt, you had better come down." He had been in mines. He had been in hand-dug wells. He had been in spaces where the walls were close and the ceiling was low and the only light was what you carried. He was not a man who was bothered by enclosure. But when he descended that ladder and stepped off the last rung onto the earth floor of Willa Dearborn's underground room, what he felt was not the adjustment to enclosure. It was the adjustment to warmth. It hit him the way warmth always hits a person who has been genuinely cold for an extended period, not as a pleasant sensation, but as a physical shock. The body systems registering the change in temperature, the way they register a sudden noise all at once, and with a kind of alarm that quickly resolved into something else entirely. His face, which had been numb for the last 40 minutes of the walk, began to ache as sensation returned to it. His fingers tingled inside the gloves. He pulled the scarf down from his face. His breath was barely visible in the air. He stood at the base of the ladder for a moment and tried to process what he was seeing. The room was small. He estimated it at 8 by 12, with a ceiling that cleared his head by perhaps 4 inches. Stone walls laid with a care that he who had built walls himself recognized as the work of someone who had thought about it deeply. A rope-frame bed along one wall, a smaller pallet against the adjacent wall, a table, 2 shelves, an oil lamp burning on the table. A hearth in the northwest corner dark. No fire, just ash and the faint trace of recent burning. Not recent enough to be responsible for the current temperature. Owen was on his pallet with a book open in his lap, looking at Ezra with the evaluative calm of a boy who has learned not to show surprise. Ivy had stopped singing and was sitting cross-legged on her pallet with a rag doll in her lap, looking at Ezra with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking. On the wall above the table, a mercury thermometer hung from a small nail. Ezra looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Willa, who had come down behind him, noticed what he was looking at. The mercury stood at 54 degrees. He did not speak for a moment. He turned and looked at the cold hearth. He looked at the ceiling, the underside of the barn floor above them, with faint movement sounds coming through it from the horses. He looked at the stone walls, at the thin line of the ventilation pipe in the northwest corner, where it rose from the hearth through the ceiling. He looked at the thermometer again. He did the arithmetic. Outside, -42. In this room with no active fire, 54. The difference between the two numbers was 96 degrees. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. His voice came out quieter than he intended. How? It was not a question so much as a word that meant, I have spent 4 days thinking you were dead, and I need you to account for the distance between that and this. Willa walked him through it. She did not perform the explanation. She delivered it the way she delivered most things, directly, without elaboration beyond what was necessary, the way a carpenter describes a joint. The Earth's thermal mass, which absorbed the heat of the small evening fires and released it over hours. The insulating effect of the hay above the barn. The livestock heat coming through the floorboards. The stable temperature of the deep earth, somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees, regardless of surface conditions, which meant the room never dropped below survivable, even without any fire at all. She had burned, she told him, approximately 1/8 of a cord of wood in 4 days. One modest fire each evening, 2 to 3 small logs burning for 2 hours, then left to die on its own. Ezra did the math on that too. He had burned close to 2.5 cords in the same 4 days in a larger space to maintain a temperature 20 degrees colder than this one. He sat down on the edge of Willa's rope-frame bed because his legs required it. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hat in his hands. He looked at Owen, who was still watching him with the measuring expression of a boy whose mother has been proved right in a situation where the cost of being wrong would have been total. Then he looked at Willa, who was standing near the table with her arms at her sides, not performing modesty, not performing triumph, simply standing there in the warm room that she had built with a pick and a shovel, and 6 weeks of 5 o'clock mornings while everyone in the valley was deciding she had gone peculiar. He said, "How long have you known this would work?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Since the night in September when I stood in the barn and realized I was not cold. I knew the principle would work. I did not know the numbers until I tested them." "Why did you not tell anyone?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You told me Wyoming clay was different from Colorado clay, Mr. Colt. Reverend Marsh told me damp earth kills slower than cold, but it still kills. Everyone who came to me came to tell me what I was doing wrong. Nobody came to ask what I had found." He had no answer for that. He sat with it the way he sat with things that were true and uncomfortable, fully, without looking for the exit. Willa opened the single drawer of the table. She took out a folded piece of paper and held it out toward him. He took it and unfolded it. It was covered in pencil marks, dimensions, ratios, notes written in a hand that was economical rather than elegant, the handwriting of someone who wrote to remember rather than to be read. The depth of the chamber, the thickness of the walls, the dimensions of the hearth, the diameter of the ventilation pipe, the slope of the drainage floor, the depth of the gravel sump. He studied it for a moment. Every number was specific. Every decision was annotated with a reason. He folded the paper carefully. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it against his chest inside his coat against the wool shirt where the body's heat would keep it from getting wet if he sweated on the walk back. He did this without asking, without discussing it. Willa watched him do it and said nothing. He climbed the ladder. At the top, before he pulled himself out through the trap door into the cold barn, he stopped. He looked down at her face below him in the lamplight. He said, "People need to know about this." Willa looked up at him from the warm room. "People thought I was crazy." He held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that what he said next carried the weight of a man who rarely spent his words freely. "People were wrong about that. People are wrong about things all the time. It does not have to be the end of it." He pulled himself up through the opening and walked out through the barn door into the storm. The walk back took him the same amount of time as the walk there, which was longer than he would have liked because the cold was intensifying again as the afternoon moved toward evening. He kept his mind on the rope along the fence line, on the placement of the snowshoes, on the management of his breathing. He did not let his mind wander to what he had found, because letting his mind wander when his body needed its full attention was the kind of thing that got men killed in weather like this. But when he reached his own barn and made it inside, and when he unstrapped the snowshoes and hung them on their nail and stood in the relative warmth of the barn with his horses and listened to the wind resuming its sustained assault on the north wall, he let himself think about it. 54 degrees, no fire, -42 outside. He pressed his palm flat against the barn's earth floor and held it there. The earth was cold at the surface, of course it was. They were in the worst winter in territory memory. But it was not as cold as the air, and he could feel, if he pressed hard and held still and paid attention, something underneath the surface cold that was different in quality. Something that the surface cold had not quite reached. Something that had been storing itself down there below the frost line patient as geology, waiting for someone to finally stop dismissing it and start using it. Helen met him at the cabin door with a look that asked the question before she spoke it, and he answered the look first. "She is fine, the children are fine." Then he came inside and stood by the fire and told his wife what he had seen, and she listened the way she listened to things that required revision of previously held positions, fully without interrupting, letting the new information settle over the old picture and change its shape. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then we mocked her. He said we did. Helen looked at the fireplace, which was burning through their wood at the rate it had been burning through it for 4 days, and which had maintained the cabin at 35 degrees on its best day since the storm began. She looked at the woodpile stacked against the east wall, which was lower than he had hoped it would be at this point in the winter. She looked at the children, both of them wrapped in blankets near the fire, the youngest with her feet on a heated stone wrapped in canvas. She said, "What will you do with that piece of paper?" He took it out from inside his coat and smoothed it on the table. He looked at the numbers, the dimensions, the notations in Willa Dearborn's economical handwriting. He thought about the families up and down the valley who were burning through their wood and their furniture and running the arithmetic on how many days they had left. He thought about Cecily Ford alone in her schoolhouse cabin with its warped walls and its cast iron stove that could not hold fire through the night. He thought about Reverend Marsh, who had told a widow that her idea was dangerous and was now burning his chairs to stay alive. He placed his palm on the paper flat the way he had placed it on the barn floor. "I am going to tell people," he said, "what it feels like to stand in a room that is 54 degrees when the world outside is 40 below." The storm broke on the 7th day. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of cessation, no sudden clearing. The wind simply began to diminish in the early morning hours, dropping from its sustained assault to something intermittent, then to occasional gusts, then to the ordinary January cold that felt, in comparison to what had preceded it, almost temperate. The sky cleared from the south first, a pale blue that expanded northward over the course of the morning, until by noon the valley was under winter sun for the first time in a week. The light on the snow was almost painful after the gray of the storm. Ezra stood in his doorway and looked across toward the Dearborn property, clearly visible. Now the barn still standing with its snow load on the roof, the cabin beside it, the thin line of the ventilation pipe emerging from the barn's north wall at foundation level. Something he had not been looking for before, and now could not stop seeing. The losses across the valley were counted over the following days as families emerged from their various forms of shelter and took stock. Two elderly residents of the Caldwell Crossing area had died. One found in his cabin, the fire out the wood exhausted. One who had apparently tried to reach a neighbor's property on the fourth day and had not made it. 7 horses were dead, 11 cattle. One family had burned their kitchen table, all 4 chairs, the children's wooden toy chest, their extra door, the framing lumber they had stored for a spring addition to their cabin. Another had dismantled a section of interior wall for fuel. Cecily Ford was found on the 5th day after the storm broke by a neighbor who had been worried about her silence. She was alive, conscious, but moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who has been very cold for a very long time. The neighbor wrapped her in blankets, fed her broth, and kept her beside a fire for 2 days before she was herself again. When she was herself again, the first thing she said, the first substantive thing beyond requests for water and expressions of thanks was, "I need to find out exactly what Willa Dearborn built under her barn." The valley looked smaller after the storm. That was the thing nobody said directly, but everyone felt that the blizzard had revealed the true scale of the country they were living in, had stripped away the comfortable illusion that human structures and human effort were adequate responses to this landscape, had shown the valley for what it was. A strip of frozen ground at the base of mountains that did not know they were inhabited. The fence posts emerged from the receding drifts at strange angles heaved by the freeze. The road to Caldwell Crossing had ceased to exist as a road for 3 weeks, returning only gradually as enough horses and wagon wheels packed the snow back into something navigable. 2 of the surviving cattle had frostbite damage to their ears that would never fully resolve. People move through the aftermath with the specific purposefulness of those who have survived something and are not yet ready to examine it. There was too much to do. Wood to replenish, animals to assess, structures to repair. A roof on the Brennan place had shed its snow load unevenly on the 4th day of the storm, buckling one of the support beams, and the family had spent 2 days in a cabin with a compromised ceiling before the storm broke enough to attempt repairs. The Collier family had lost their milk cow. She had been their primary source of winter protein, and the loss of her put the spring's calculation in a different and more uncomfortable register. The 2 deaths were mourned in the way that frontier deaths are mourned, which is to say with a grief that is real but cannot be extended, because the living require the same attention that the dead have ceased to need. Because the season does not pause for funerals. Because in a place where survival is not guaranteed, the loss of neighbors is also a loss of a specific portion of the community's collective capacity to endure. Reverend Marsh conducted the services on consecutive Sundays in the church that had survived the storm with its walls intact, which was itself something to be grateful for, because not every structure in the valley could claim the same. Marsh did not speak about Willa Dearborn from the pulpit during those weeks. He did not need to. The story had already moved through the valley in the way that stories move when they carry both information people need and a moral that people are not entirely comfortable with, quickly, completely, with a momentum that required no assistance from any single teller. He came to her property on a Thursday afternoon in the 2nd week of February, 11 days after the storm's end. He came alone, which was the first thing she noticed when she saw him from the barn door. No wife, no deacon, no buffer of social formality. Just Aldous Marsh on a dark horse, picking his way down the lane through the hard-packed snow, his coat collar turned up, his hat pulled low against the cold that had returned to more ordinary levels, but had not departed. She waited for him at the barn door. She did not go inside to receive him, did not make tea, did not perform the rituals of hosting that would have framed his visit as something social. She waited because she wanted to see what kind of visit this was before she decided how to receive it. He dismounted, tied his horse walk to where she stood. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke, which was unusual for him. Marsh was a man who generally had words ready before he arrived at the place that required them. "Mrs. Dearborn." He stopped, tried again. "I would like to see it if you would allow me." "The room." A pause that carried its own weight. "I should have asked differently the first time." She studied him. He was not a man who apologized easily, not because he was proud in a cruel way, but because he operated in a professional world where expressing uncertainty damaged the thing he needed most to do his work. A minister whose congregation sees him doubt is a minister whose congregation begins to doubt along with him, and doubt in a Wyoming winter was not a luxury anyone could afford. She understood this about him. She had always understood it even when she found it obstructing. She stepped aside from the barn door. He followed her and waited while she lit the lantern, watched as she opened the trap door. He descended the ladder without comment, stepping off the last rung onto the earth floor, the way a man steps into water whose depth he is testing. She came down behind him. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly the way a person turns in a space when they are trying to understand it rather than simply see it. He looked at the stone walls, each one laid with the careful inward lean she had given them. He looked at the timber ceiling. He looked at the small hearth in the northwest corner which had a modest fire going. He looked at the thermometer, 58 degrees with the fire active. He stood in that warmth for a long time without speaking. The silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between people with unresolved disagreements are uncomfortable. It was more like the silence of a person who is doing arithmetic that requires concentration and does not want to be interrupted before the calculation is complete. He turned to look at her. His face had the specific expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he did not expect to arrive at and is honest enough not to pretend otherwise. "I told you the earth would get in your lungs." His voice was even, the Virginia cadence present in the back vowels. "I told you this the way I tell people things from the pulpit, as though certainty was the most important thing I could offer you." He paused. "I was not offering you certainty. I was offering you my assumption dressed up as knowledge." Willa said nothing. She had learned over the course of her life that when a person was in the process of saying something true about themselves, the worst thing you could do was make it easier for them to stop. Marsh looked at the floor, the tamped earth firm as wood beneath their feet, dry as the inside of a book. "I was wrong about the application. I was also wrong about you, which is a different kind of wrong." He met her eyes directly. "I came to tell you that." It was not an apology. It was something heavier than an apology. A man of standing in a community where standing was currency, stating plainly that he had misjudged the person in front of him. In Willa's experience, that was rarer than an apology, harder to produce, more expensive to give. She said, "I appreciate you coming." She meant it without sentiment, which was how she meant most things. He climbed back up the ladder 10 minutes later, untied his horse, rode back toward Caldwell Crossing. She watched him go from the barn door. Then she went back down to tend the fire, because the fire was what kept the room warm. The room was what kept her children safe. The children were what made all of it matter. And Aldous Marsh's reckoning with his own assumptions, while real and meaningful, was not her primary concern on a February afternoon with 2 cords of wood still in the pile. Cecily Ford arrived 6 days later with a canvas satchel over her shoulder that contained a measuring tape, a notebook with a red cover, 3 pencils, a small spirit level, a folding rule, the kind of instruments a person carries when they intend to be precise about something. She had the look of someone who has been thinking about a single problem for 2 weeks and has arrived with the problem mostly solved, but needing one category of information that only a physical visit could provide. She said, "I want to measure everything if you will let me. Not just the room, the hearth, the pipe, the angle of the walls, the depth of the sump, all of it." She paused. "I am building in the spring. I am not spending another winter the way I spent this one." Willa stepped back from the door. What followed was 3 hours of the most methodical examination that the underground room had received since Willa built it. Cecily moved through the space with her measuring tape and her spirit level, calling dimensions aloud and writing them into the red notebook in a hand that was small, dense, utterly legible. She measured the ceiling height at 3 points. She measured the wall thickness by probing the junction between stone face and earth, backing with a thin rod she had brought for the purpose. She measured the hearth opening, the flue diameter, the angle at which the ventilation pipe exited through the ceiling. She laid the spirit level on the floor and recorded the 1/4 inch per foot drainage slope toward the sump corner. Then she asked to see the notebook. Willa retrieved it from the shelf above the bed. The small household notebook, the same one she had used to track seed inventory before it became a construction log. She handed it to Cecily without comment. Cecily opened it to the first construction page and read it with the focused attention she brought to everything, turning pages carefully, occasionally going back to compare one entry against another. When she finished, she held the notebook for a moment before returning it. Her expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a teacher's expression changes when a student produces something that exceeds what the teacher had predicted was possible. "You understand what this is?" Not a question. Willa took the notebook back. It is how I thought through the problem. It is systematic inquiry, Mrs. Dearborn. You identified variables, you controlled for them, you tested your hypotheses against measurable outcomes, you recorded the results. Cecily closed her own notebook. I taught science at a school in Pennsylvania before I came here. This is how science is done. Willa set the notebook back on its shelf. I needed my children to live through the winter. The method that accomplished that is whatever it needs to be called. Cecily looked at her for a long moment. I am going to write about this. Not to embarrass you, to make sure other people have access to what you found out. She paused. I would like to use your numbers. Use whatever you like. It is not a secret. Cecily climbed back up the ladder with her satchel over her shoulder, paused at the ventilation pipe where it emerged from the north wall, presumably noting its exterior angle. Then the barn door closed and her boots crunched away across the snow. That evening after supper, Owen helped Willa wash the plates, a task they shared in silence, the way they had shared the digging without needing to narrate it. When they finished, he sat at the table while she mended a pair of his trousers, and after a while he said, Mrs. Ford had a notebook. Willa said she did. She was writing things down about what you built. She is going to build her own. She needed the measurements. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, Mama, why did you not tell them before the storm? You knew it worked. You measured it. Why did you not say so? She set the trousers down. It was the question she had been waiting for without knowing she had been waiting for it. The question that deserved a real answer, because it would change something in how he saw the world, which is the only version of the question that ever matters. She looked at her son across the small table in the lamplight. He was 10 years old. He had dug beside her in the cold pre-dawn dark for 6 weeks without complaining, without asking for recognition, without requiring the work to be explained before he would do it. He had earned a real answer more than anyone she had spoken to since October. She said, because I came to them with something they had not seen before, and they came back to me with everything they already knew. Every person who visited me that autumn arrived with a conclusion already formed. None of them came to ask what I had found. They came to tell me what I had missed. Owen looked at the table, turning it over in the way he turned things. Then he looked up, and what he said next came out with the simple directness of someone who has thought a thing through to its end. But the winter asked. The winter did not have an opinion about proper houses or proper ways of doing things. It just came. The same for everyone. He paused. You had already answered it before anyone else knew the question was being asked. She looked at her son for a long moment. He was 10 years old, and he had just articulated the things she had spent an entire season living through without quite finding the words for. She said, that is exactly right. The spring came late, which spring always did in the Wyoming Territory, arriving not as a sudden warmth, but as a slow negotiation, days above freezing, followed by nights that reclaimed what the days had offered. The snow retreating in patches, rather than all at once, the mud arriving before the ground was fully ready for traffic. By March, the road to Caldwell Crossing was passable again. By April, the first of the survey crews that preceded homestead expansion were moving through the valley. By May, the valley had returned to something that resembled its summer self, though everyone who had come through the winter carried it differently than they had carried previous winters. Douglas Fenn mentioned it to Willa in April when she came into the general store for seed and basic supplies. He was a careful man, Fenn, who had run the store for 12 years without giving significant offense to anyone, which in a community this size required a form of social dexterity that was underappreciated by people who had never tried it. He said, setting her flour on the counter, I have ordered additional fire brick from the supplier in Cheyenne, more clay tile pipe as well. 3 families have asked about the materials in the past 2 weeks. He said it without emphasis, without editorializing, as a man of commerce reports inventory decisions. I thought you would want to know. Willa paid for her flour. She walked out of the store into the April sun, which was genuinely warm for the first time in months. Warm enough that she stopped for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, with her face turned up to it, feeling the heat on her skin. She allowed herself in that moment a brief recognition of what the winter had proved. Not triumph, something quieter. The specific satisfaction of a wager paid in full. She had staked her children's lives on a calculation. The calculation had held. The evidence was in the numbers and the living. Then she climbed onto the wagon and drove back to Harrow Creek because the seed needed planting, and the drainage ditch on the south fence line needed clearing before the spring thaw made it into a problem. Cecily's article appeared in the Wyoming Settlers Gazette in August of 1887, occupying the lower half of page 3. It was titled Earth-Sheltered Winter Rooms, a Practical System for Northern Territory Homesteads. Cecily had structured it as a how-to, which was deliberate. She had understood that what the valley needed was not a celebration of one woman's ingenuity, but a replicable system that anyone with basic tools could attempt. The article described the principle first: the physics of thermal mass, the stable temperature of deep earth, the insulating effect of overhead structure. Then it described the construction sequence, citing the specific dimensions and material choices that Willa had developed and tested. It mentioned Willa by name in the first sentence. During the severe winter of 1887, a system developed by Mrs. Willa Dearborn of Harrow Creek allowed her family to maintain interior temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit using a fraction of the fuel consumed by neighboring homesteads using conventional above-ground cabins. Willa read the article once the day after Cecily brought her a copy. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of the table beneath the household notebook, beneath the seed inventory records, beneath the letter from her sister in Columbus that she had been meaning to answer since November. The article mattered. She knew it mattered. But it was not the thing that mattered most to her, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. What mattered most happened in October of 1887, when Ezra Colt arrived at her property on a Sunday afternoon with his son Thomas, who was 32, rangy with his father's deliberate way of moving, and his son-in-law Marcus Webb, who was 28 and still carried some of the adaptability of a man who has not yet formed fixed opinions about what is possible. They had tools with them: a pick, 2 shovels, a measuring rod, a coil of rope. Ezra did not announce the purpose of the visit because it was evident. He walked to the barn, looked at the door, looked at Willa. She opened the door. They went in. Willa opened the trap door and led them down. Thomas and Marcus descended in turn, both of them going through the same adjustment that every person went through on that first descent: the physical surprise of warmth, the involuntary loosening that came with it. Thomas pressed his hand against the stone wall, held it there, pulled it away, pressed it again. Marcus stood at the center of the room and turned the same slow circle that Marsh had turned before him, taking inventory of everything. Ezra stood near the ladder and watched his son and son-in-law encounter what he had encountered in January, and his face had the expression of a man who has carried a piece of knowledge for 9 months and is finally passing it to the people it was meant for. Thomas said, "How long did it take her to build it?" Ezra said, 7 weeks, alone, before sunrise every morning. Marcus looked at the hearth. He crouched down, examined the clay lining of the firebox, examined the angle of the flue. He looked at the ventilation pipe connection. He stood back up and looked at Willa. His voice carried the careful respect of someone asking a real question. "Could I build this into an existing root cellar? I have got a dug root cellar on my property, maybe 5 feet deep, 8 by 10. If I extended the depth, added proper stone walls, cut a vent system, the principle would work," Willa told him. "The specifics would need to adapt to what you have. Your drainage situation will be different from mine. Your soil composition will be different. You would need to assess those before you finalize the dimensions." Marcus nodded slowly, the nod of a person filing information against future use. "Would you look at it before I start? Just tell me what you see." She looked at him, this young man with his careful question, his willingness to arrive without conclusions already formed. She thought about the quality of asking about the difference between people who come with their knowledge shaped into a verdict and people who come with an open question that expects a real answer. She said, "Bring me the measurements of what you have. The depth, the soil type, where the water table sits in spring. I will look at them." They stayed for 2 hours asking questions she answered, and asking questions she redirected back to them when the answer depended on their specific conditions rather than universal principles. When they climbed back up through the trap door, Ezra was the last one out. He stood on the barn floor for a moment, looking down at the closed trap door, and then he looked at Willa. 25 years in this country," he said. 25 years of learning what works out here and what does not. Thinking I had a working catalog of the territory's possibilities." He paused. "You built something I did not know was buildable." Willa considered what to say. She settled on the truth, which was also the only thing she had ever been able to settle on. "You build from what you know, Mr. Colt. I knew what it felt like to have my daughter nearly die in a cabin that could not hold heat. That is a different kind of knowledge than 25 years of ranching. Neither one of us had the complete picture. Ezra was quiet for a moment, then low, no, but you were the one who went looking for what was missing. Marcus Webb paused at the barn door, turned back to look at her one more time with the expression of someone making a decision he intends to keep. "Thank you," he said. Then he walked out into the October afternoon with Thomas, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their conversation already turning to the practicalities of what they intended to build before the next winter arrived. Ezra followed them out. At the barn door, he stopped for a moment, one hand on the frame, and looked back at Willa. She stood in the barn's interior with a lantern in her hand, her gray-blue eyes steady, her expression carrying the composure of a woman who has been through the thing that was supposed to break her and has arrived somewhere on the other side of it. He did not say anything further. He simply nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who recognizes something he intends to carry forward, and walked out into the afternoon. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was not as severe as the year before. None would be in living memory, because the blizzard of January 1887 remained an outlier in the territory's experience, a once-in-a-generation event that people would refer to by name for decades. But it was still Wyoming, still the Northern Territory, still capable of temperatures that killed the unprepared. By October of 1887, 4 families within 15 miles of Harrow Creek had modified their root cellars or built new underground chambers based on the system Willa had developed. Each of them made adaptations, different stone, different dimensions. One family using split logs instead of fieldstone for the walls, another incorporating a second small hearth in a larger chamber. The principles remained consistent across all of them: depth below the frost line, thermal mass in the walls, drainage to a low point sump, modest fire to supplement rather than replace the Earth's own retention. None of them reported temperatures below 50 degrees on the coldest nights of that winter. Douglas Fenn's order of additional fire bricks sold out in November. He wrote to his supplier in Cheyenne requesting double the previous quantity for the following year, including in his letter a brief explanation of the local demand, which the supplier forwarded to a building materials wholesaler in Denver, who mentioned it to an engineer from the Colorado School of Mines who was visiting his office that week. The engineer was interested in thermal mass applications for mine infrastructure and asked for more details. The wholesaler wrote back to Fenn, who wrote back to the engineer, who wrote to Cecily Ford requesting a copy of her article. She provided it along with a letter describing the construction sequence in more technical detail than the newspaper piece had permitted. None of this was visible to Willa. She was splitting wood for the winter supply when Cecily mentioned the correspondence in passing during a November visit. Willa listened, nodded, split the next piece of wood. Cecily watched her for a moment and said nothing more about it. She had come to understand that Willa Dearborn's indifference to recognition was not performance. It was simply the natural disposition of a woman who had been too busy surviving to develop an appetite for being celebrated for it. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the one in which Willa finished the second underground room. She had been planning it since spring, in the same way she planned everything in pencil, in the household notebook, in the early morning hours before the children were up. The first room had been built for survival. The second was built for living. She made it larger, 10 by 16 feet, with a ceiling height that gave full standing room with 2 inches to spare. She incorporated 2 small windows set into light well shafts, cut through the ground at an angle lined with stone, filled with heavy glass salvaged from the wreck of a freight wagon that had come apart on the mountain road the previous fall. The light wells did not provide much illumination, but they provided some which changed the quality of the space in a way that the numbers did not fully capture. She added a second hearth on the east wall, smaller than the first, connected to the same ventilation system through a split flue that Thomas helped her design over a Sunday afternoon. Thomas had been thinking about thermodynamics since his October visit the previous year and had developed ideas that were genuinely useful, a way of equalizing pressure across the 2 hearth connections so that neither one backdrafted against the other. They worked it out together, arguing about it in the amiable way of people who care about the problem more than about being right, and the system they arrived at was better than what either of them had started with. Owen was 11 that autumn, old enough to take on a full adult's share of the physical work. He dug alongside her again, but differently. Not the boy carrying buckets, but someone with a shaping idea of his own about where the walls should run, about the angle of the light wells, about whether the entries should be positioned differently than the first room's trapdoor. She listened to him the way she wished people had listened to her, without the assumption of error, without the preformed response waiting behind the listening. Sometimes she disagreed with him. She said so when she did explain why, showed him the reasoning. Sometimes he disagreed back. Occasionally he was right. Ivy was 8 that autumn, old enough to have developed opinions about the new room's furnishings, which she expressed with the combination of certainty and flexibility that was her natural mode. She wanted the east wall for her sleeping place because the east wall would catch the first light from the east-facing light well in the morning. She wanted a shelf for her books at precisely the height that meant she could reach the bottom shelf from bed without getting up. She wanted a hook for her coat near the ladder because she was tired of having to go back for her coat. All 3 of these requests were accommodated because they were reasonable, because they cost nothing to accommodate, because Willa was building this room for her children as much as for herself. When Ezra came in December of 1889 with Thomas and Marcus, they found a space that bore the same relationship to the original room that a finished house bears to a rough camp. The walls were the same dry stone but plastered now over the face with a lime-clay mix that Willa had developed through 3 trial batches, which smoothed the surface and reflected the lamplight instead of absorbing it. The floor was the same tamped earth but sealed with a thin coat of the same clay mixture, hardened to a surface you could sweep. 2 light wells sent pale shafts of December afternoon light across the floor from the east and north faces. The second hearth, smaller than the first, burned with the efficiency that Thomas's pressure equalization had provided. The temperature in the room was 61 degrees. Ezra walked the perimeter slowly, his hand trailing along the plastered wall. He stopped at one of the light wells and looked up the angled shaft to the sky, which was a small gray rectangle at the top lit with pale winter light. He stood there for a long moment. Thomas moved to the second hearth and crouched to examine the flue connection. Marcus stood near the center of the room, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the ceiling with an expression that suggested he was already calculating what modifications might improve the root cellar chamber he had built on his own property the previous autumn. Ezra turned from the light well and looked at Willa. "You built a home," he said. Willa considered the word. It was different from what she had been calling it in her mind. She had been calling it the room, the underground room, the chamber, functional terms for a functional thing. She looked at what she had made. Ivy was at her shelf choosing a book with the specific, focused pleasure of a child in her own space. Owen was at the table across from where his mother stood, working through the mathematics that the Caldwell Crossing School had assigned for the winter break. The second hearth was burning its small, clean fire in the east corner. The horses moved in their stalls above their weight, pressing the boards, their heat seeping down through the wood the way it always had. She looked at the hook by the ladder where 3 coats hung size small to large. She said, "Yes, I think it is." They stayed another hour, the 3 men asking questions and examining details with the attention of people who have built things themselves and therefore understand what they are looking at. When they finally climbed back up through the trapdoor and made their way out into the December afternoon, the sun was low over the western ridge, throwing long shadows across the snow. Willa stood in the barn doorway and watched them cross the yard toward their horses. She watched until they crossed the ridge and dropped out of sight, the valley going quiet around her, in the way that Wyoming valleys go quiet in December. Not empty, but held as if the land itself were conserving something for the months ahead. Then she closed the barn door, lifted the lantern from its nail, opened the trap door, and went down the ladder. Ivy looked up from her book. Owen looked up from his mathematics. Their mother moved to the small table and sat down, opened the household notebook to a fresh page, picked up the pencil. She wrote the date, December 14th, 1889, then the temperature. Then, as she had written on every page since October of 1886, what she had observed that day and what it meant and what she intended to do next. The years that followed were quieter ones by comparison, but quieter in the way that things become quiet when they have found their proper shape. Owen grew into the kind of young man who approached problems with his mother's deliberateness, not slow but thorough, unwilling to act on incomplete information. When he built his own homestead in 1897, 30 miles west of Harrow Creek, the underground room he incorporated into the design was larger than his mother's original chamber, modified with concrete walls and a proper light well that admitted real daylight through 2 south-facing panes of glass. He called it his mother's design. People who visited asked where he had learned it, and he told them plainly the same way she had always told people things, without embellishment, without excessive credit claiming, just the facts of where the idea had come from and why it worked. Ivy became a teacher at the Caldwell Crossing School, which had been rebuilt with better lumber after the original structure's warped walls were finally condemned. She kept in the top drawer of her classroom desk beneath a stack of student arithmetic papers the household notebook that her mother had used to plan and document the construction of the underground room. She had asked for it when Willa offered it, and Willa had handed it over without ceremony, the way she handed most things, with the understanding that the object's value was in its use, not its preservation. When students asked Ivy about the notebook, which they occasionally did after spotting it during desk inspections, she told them the story. Not the heroic version, not the version where the ending is obvious from the beginning. The true version in which a woman who had been mocked for an unusual idea spent a winter being proved right by circumstances that could easily have proved her wrong instead. She told them about the specific temperature, 54 degrees, no fire, negative 42 outside, because numbers have a way of making abstract things real. She told them about Ezra Colt walking 2 miles in a blizzard with a digging bar over his shoulder, expecting to find the worst, and finding instead a woman making coffee in a 54-degree room while her children read and sang. She told them what the winter had asked and what Willa Dearborn had answered before anyone else knew the question was coming. The phrase the students remembered, the phrase that traveled from Ivy's classroom back to their homes and occasionally resurfaced years later in conversations about the Valley's early history, had not come from Willa herself. It had come from Owen, recounting to his sister one evening what their mother had said to him on the night she led him down into the unfinished room and put his hand against the warm stone wall in the lamplight. The earth has already done the work. All you have to do is use it. Willa Dearborn lived on the Harrow Creek property until 1911, when she sold the land and moved into Caldwell Crossing to be closer to Ivy, who had a family by then and whose children were old enough to require the kind of attention that a grandmother provides differently than a mother does. The buyers of the property, a couple from Nebraska who had been homesteading in the territory for 3 years, specifically asked about the underground rooms during the negotiation. They had heard about them. They wanted to know if they were still sound. Willa walked them through both chambers on the day they came to look, showed them the drainage system, demonstrated the ventilation draw with a lit match held near the flue opening, let them stand in the rooms and feel the temperature for themselves. They bought the property that afternoon. The new owners used both rooms through every winter for the next 20 years, making small repairs as needed, but no significant changes to the original design. The second room, the larger one with the plastered walls and the light wells, became the room where the family spent winter evenings, the husband reading, the wife sewing, the children doing their school assignments at the table that Willa had left behind because it was too heavy to move and fit the space too well to justify the effort of replacement. They did not know every particular of what they were living in. They knew a widow had built it alone, one bucket of earth at a time before sunrise, while the valley decided she had gone peculiar. They knew it worked. For most purposes, that was enough. The Wyoming Territory had become Wyoming State in 1890, and the frontier era that had shaped Willa Dearborn's circumstances gradually gave way to something more organized, more connected, more forgiving of its inhabitants. In the specific sense that supply lines improved, and the distance between a family and difficulty, and the resources that could help them shrank over the years from days to hours. But the winters did not change. The mountains to the north did not change. The wind that came off them in January did not moderate its ambitions simply because the territory had been granted statehood. In the Harrow Creek Valley, through the winters that followed the blizzard of 1887, and the decades that followed those, the families who had adopted Willa Dearborn's approach continued to use it, adapting the design as materials and methods improved, but holding to the underlying principle she had demonstrated one November evening with a mercury thermometer and 2 logs and an hour of modest fire. The principle had not changed because it could not change the earth stores. What it receives gives back what it has stored, protects what shelters within it from the wind that does not know to stop. This was not a lesson that Willa had invented. Humans had been using the earth for shelter since before there was a word for shelter. What she had done was rediscover it at the moment when the rediscovery was needed most, using the materials available to her in the place where she stood solving the problem that was killing people, demonstrating through the most persuasive argument available. The argument of survival that the old understanding was still true and still useful and had been waiting under the frost line patient as geology for someone to stop dismissing it and start using it. She lived to 64, which was not old and was not young for a woman of her time and circumstance. She lived without significant public recognition, without a monument, without the newspaper retrospective that might have marked her contribution in more dramatic terms. The Wyoming Settlers Gazette article remained the only formal documentation of what she had done, and it was 3 column inches on page 3 of a weekly paper with a circulation of 400. But on a January night in 1888, when the temperature outside the Harrow Creek Valley dropped to -35, and the families in their various forms of underground shelter checked their thermometers and found readings between 50 and 60 degrees and went back to sleep, there was something present in that valley that had not been there the winter before. Not just warmth, the specific confidence that comes from understanding the system you are living in well enough to work with it rather than against it. Willa Dearborn had not given them warmth. The earth had always had warmth to give. She had given them the knowledge that it was there, and the proof that it was accessible, and the demonstration that the proof was in the living. The earth did not change. The cold did not change. She had simply stopped arguing with what was already true about both of them. She had listened instead to what the ground beneath her hands had been saying all along. She had written it down in pencil in a household notebook. She had tested it with a match and 2 logs and a mercury thermometer on a November evening while her children slept. She had descended into the dark and built with a pick and a shovel, and the specific determination of a woman who has run out of alternatives a room where her children could breathe without their breath showing. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was in the final accounting everything.